History has given him a name steeped in sorrow, the weeping prophet. When we think of Jeremiah, we picture a solitary, tragic figure, his face etched with a pain so profound that his tears have echoed through millennia. We are told he wept for the coming destruction of his nation, for the siege of Babylon that he saw with horrifying clarity. He wept for a people deaf to his warnings, for a king who chose foolish pride over divine counsel. His story is the ultimate tragedy of a man who spoke the truth and was hated for it, a patriot forced to watch his beloved Jerusalem burn. And all of this is true. But what if it is not the whole truth? What if the tears that streamed down Jeremiah's face were born not just from sorrow, but from sheer, unadulterated terror? What if the visions that broke his heart were not merely of advancing armies and crumbling walls, but of something far older, far darker, lurking just behind the veil of the visible world, the traditional telling of Jeremiah's story? As moving as it is, presents a fundamentally human drama. It's a story of political failure, moral decay, and the tragic consequences of disobedience. But this interpretation feels incomplete. It doesn't fully account for the almost supernatural depth of his anguish, the sense that he was wrestling with a darkness that was more than just human stubbornness. What if Jeremiah's true burden was not just seeing the future, but seeing the forces shaping that future? What if the reason he cried was not because he saw the Babylonian army at the gates, but because he was the only one who could see the invisible legions that were marching with them? What if the idolatry he condemned was not just a religious mistake, but an open invitation to ancient, demonic entities? The conventional story of the weeping prophet is a story of pain. Tonight, we will explore the forbidden story of his terror. To understand the true source of Jeremiah's terror, we must look beyond the familiar pages of his prophecy. His book is a meticulous record of the symptoms of a nation's spiritual disease. But to understand the disease itself, we must consult the ancient medical journals of the cosmos, the very texts that were later censored for being too explicit, too supernatural. We must once again open the forbidden scrolls of the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. These texts are not just parallel histories, they are the intelligence briefings on the unseen enemy. While the canonical Bible speaks of sin and idolatry, these books give us the names, origins, and operational strategies of the forces that drive humanity toward those very sins. They speak of a time before the Great Flood, when fallen angels, the Watchers, corrupted the earth, and they testify to a chilling truth, though the bodies of their giant offspring, the Nephilim, were destroyed in the deluge, their disembodied spirits were not. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees both record a terrifying divine concession. After the flood, a portion of these malignant spirits was permitted to remain on earth. They were not to be bound in the abyss with their fallen fathers, but were allowed to roam, to tempt, to torment, and to lead humanity astray. Jubilees even names their commander, a formidable entity known as Prince Mastema, the Lord of Hostility, who acts as a celestial prosecutor and the general of this invisible army of corruption. These texts provide the missing context for Jeremiah's world. They reveal that the other gods the Israelites were turning to were not just lifeless idols of wood and stone. They were not just empty religious ideas. They were fronts, corporate shells for these very same ancient, disembodied spirits. The worship of Baal, the sacrifices to Molech, the devotion to the Queen of Heaven, these were not just acts of religious infidelity. They were acts of treason. They were deliberate, conscious invitations for these demonic entities to enter, influence, and ultimately possess the land and the people of the covenant. And this brings us to the core of our investigation. What if Jeremiah, a priest with a seer's vision, was shown not just the future, but the spiritual reality of the present? What if, when he looked at the high places of idol worship, he didn't just see stone altars, but saw the shimmering, malevolent presences that were feeding on that worship? This is the forbidden truth that later theology, in its desire for a more rational and less superstitious faith, chose to hide. The war Jeremiah was fighting was not just for the soul of his nation, it was an exorcism. To comprehend the true nature of Jeremiah's terror, we must walk with him to the edge of a ravine just outside Jerusalem, a place so foul, so steeped in primal horror, that its name would eventually become the very word for Hell Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom. It is here that the prophet confronts the most unspeakable sin of his people, a crime that transcends mere human depravity. It is here that they built the high places of Topheth to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire as offerings to a god named Molech. This is the crack in the narrative that no simple explanation can fill. How does a nation that received the law, "Thou shalt not kill," from the mouth of God on a holy mountain, arrive at a place where they are systematically sacrificing their own children? This is not the sin of greed, or lust, or common idolatry. This is a line that separates humanity from monstrosity. The traditional explanation that this was simply a misguided pagan ritual feels hollow. It fails to account for the sheer gravitational pull of such a horrific practice. What kind of darkness must possess a people to convince them that the ultimate act of worship is to hear the screams of their own burning child? The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees provide the answer. And it is a truth far more terrifying than simple human error. They testify that the gods of the nations, like Molech, were not just lifeless statues of wood and stone. They were names, masks, for the very real, very active, and very hungry disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the fallen watchers. These were beings born of violence, whose existence on earth was a plague of consumption, and whose spirits, after the flood, remained, carrying with them an insatiable appetite for the life force they no longer possessed. In this horrifying light, the sacrifices in the Valley of Hinnom are revealed for what they truly were. They were not just a religious ceremony, they were a feeding. The people of Judah were not just breaking a commandment, they were entering into a covenant with the ancient enemies of God. They were nourishing these spiritual parasites with the purest life force they could offer the lives of their own innocent children. Now, imagine Jeremiah, the seer, the prophet, standing on the edge of that valley. His tears were not just for the human tragedy, as devastating as that was. His terror came from what his prophetic eyes were open to see. He didn't just see fire and smoke. He saw the shimmering, malevolent entity on the other side of the veil, the carnivorous deity that was gorging itself on the souls of Judah's children. He didn't just hear the cries of parents. He heard the triumphant laughter of a demon. This is the secret vision. This is the truth the later church, in its attempt to rationalize evil, had to hide. Jeremiah was not just a prophet of political doom. He was an exorcist for an entire nation. He was a man forced to witness his people willingly feeding their children to monsters. And he was the only one in the kingdom who could actually see the monster. His tears were not just of sorrow. They were the tears of a man staring into the very face of hell. The horror of the Valley of Hinnom was the most extreme symptom of Judah's spiritual disease, but it was not the only one. Jeremiah also confronted a more widespread and seemingly benign form of apostasy, a popular cult that had captured the hearts of the people, especially the women, the worship of a figure known as the Queen of Heaven. In chapter 44 of his book, After the Fall of Jerusalem, Jeremiah confronts the remnant of Judah who had fled to Egypt. He pleads with them to abandon their idolatry, reminding them that this was the very sin that brought destruction upon their homeland. But they openly defy him. The women, in particular, declare, "We will certainly do everything we said we would. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and will pour out drink offerings to her, just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials did." On the surface, this might seem like a simple reversion to a common pagan fertility cult. The Queen of Heaven is often associated with ancient goddesses like Ishtar or Astarte, deities of love, fertility, and war. But when viewed through the lens of the forbidden books, this was not just a lapse into paganism. It was a deliberate reopening of a very old and very dangerous door. The Book of Enoch provides the key. It testifies that among the illicit secrets taught by the fallen watchers, some were specifically aimed at women. The angels taught them the art of seduction, the use of cosmetics, enchantments, and adornments to inflame lust. This was not merely a lesson in vanity, it was a spiritual technology, a way of manipulating life force and desire, a cornerstone of the ancient fertility cults that would later sweep the Near East. The worship of the Queen of Heaven, therefore, was not a new invention. It was a direct continuation of the pre-flood religion of the Watchers. When the women of Judah baked cakes for her and poured out drink offerings, they were not just honoring a generic goddess of fertility, they were unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, participating in a covenant that stretched all the way back to the original corruption of humanity. They were reenacting the rituals and tapping into the spiritual power introduced by the very beings whose actions had caused the great flood. Jeremiah's desperate opposition to this cult was not born of simple religious intolerance. He, as a prophet, could see the spiritual lineage. He understood that the Queen of Heaven was not a harmless folk deity. She was a mask for the ancient spirit of seduction and corruption that had once brought the world to ruin. The people saw a comforting mother goddess. Jeremiah saw the lingering shadow of the fallen ones. His tears were for a people who were so spiritually blind that they were seeking comfort in the arms of their oldest and most deceptive enemy. In the traditional telling of Jeremiah's story, the Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, is portrayed as a formidable but ultimately human force. They are the political and military instrument of God's judgment, the rod of his anger, as Isaiah would say. Jeremiah's prophecies are seen as predictions of a coming geopolitical catastrophe. But this interpretation, while historically accurate on the surface, misses the terrifying supernatural dimension that the forbidden books reveal. The Book of Jubilees introduces us to the true architect of Judah's suffering, Prince Mastema. As we have seen, Mastema is the commander of the evil spirits. the great adversary who, in the heavenly court, was granted divine permission to test, accuse, and bring calamity upon a disobedient humanity. He is not a rogue agent, he is a sanctioned instrument of judgment, a celestial prosecutor whose role is to execute the sentences that sin has incurred. This is the secret vision that reframes the entire Babylonian invasion. Jeremiah did not just see an earthly army mustering at the borders. He was given a glimpse into the spiritual reality behind it. He saw that the legions of Babylon were not marching alone. Their campaign of terror was being orchestrated, amplified, and spiritually empowered by Mastema and his host of demonic spirits. The physical invasion was merely the earthly manifestation of a far greater supernatural assault. This explains the almost inhuman cruelty and totality of the destruction. It wasn't just a conquest, it was a desecration. It wasn't just a political defeat, it was a spiritual humiliation. The forces of Babylon were acting as the physical hosts for the very same ancient spirits that had once corrupted the world before the flood. The spirit of violence, the spirit of pride, the spirit of idolatry, all of these found a willing vessel in the Babylonian Empire. When Jeremiah prophesied that God was bringing disaster from the north, he was speaking on two levels. On the physical level, he meant the armies of Babylon, but on the spiritual level, he was referring to the demonic hosts of Mastema, whose domain, in ancient cosmology, was often associated with the dark and chaotic utmost north. This is the source of his profound terror. He was not just a prophet predicting a lost war. He was a spiritual watchman on the walls, forced to see the invisible demonic hordes pouring into his nation alongside the visible human soldiers. He saw that his people were not just fighting against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And he was the only one who could see them. His tears were for a nation that was not only about to be conquered, but possessed. The Babylonian invasion was not the cause of Judah's death. It was the final symptom of a demonic infection that had already rotted the nation from the inside out. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence for this spiritual invasion comes not from a forbidden book, but from the visions of Jeremiah's contemporary, the prophet Ezekiel. While Jeremiah was prophesying in Jerusalem before its fall, Ezekiel was among the first wave of exiles in Babylon. And it is there, by the river Chebar, that God grants him a supernatural vision that confirms Jeremiah's deepest fears in the most graphic way imaginable. In chapter 8 of his book, Ezekiel is spiritually transported back to Jerusalem. He is not shown the external threats of the Babylonian army, but is taken on a terrifying tour of the internal corruption of the temple itself. He is led, step by step, through the sacred courts, and what he sees is a scene from a horror film. In one chamber, he sees the elders of Israel, the religious leaders, in total darkness, burning incense before a wall covered with idols of creeping things and detestable beasts. They whisper to each other, "The Lord does not see us." Then he is taken to another gate, where he sees women weeping for Tammuz, a Mesopotamian god of death and resurrection, a pagan ritual being performed within the holy precincts. Finally, he is brought to the inner court, the very space between the porch and the altar, and there he sees the ultimate abomination, 25 men, with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, bowing down in worship to the sun. This is not a vision of simple disobedience. This is a vision of a hostile takeover. Ezekiel is being shown that the temple, the supposed dwelling place of God on earth, has been systematically infiltrated and occupied by the very demonic entities that Jeremiah was fighting against. The worship of Molech in the valley was the public face of the apostasy, but this was the secret, internal rot. The spiritual leaders of the nation were not just tolerating idolatry. They were actively consorting with demonic powers in the heart of their most sacred space. This vision provides the crucial context for Jeremiah's unbearable sorrow. As a priest himself, his agony was not just that the physical temple would be destroyed by the Babylonians. His terror was that the temple had already fallen. It had become a spiritual beachhead for the enemy, a den of demonic activity, a corrupted vessel that God had no choice but to shatter. Jeremiah's tears were for a house that was no longer his father's, but had become a haunted palace, its holy chambers filled with the whispering shadows of ancient gods. The destruction by Nebuchadnezzar was not an act of foreign aggression. It was a divine and necessary act of spiritual demolition. God had to burn down his own house to fumigate it from the demonic infestation that had taken root within its walls. With the evidence laid bare, a prophet staring into the face of child-sacrificing demons, a nation in covenant with ancient spirits, and a temple secretly occupied by supernatural foes. The question becomes, why have we not been taught this story? Why has the raw, cosmic horror of Jeremiah's experience been softened into a simple moral lesson about idolatry? Who were the gatekeepers who chose to domesticate this divine terror? The culprits were not a single council, but a long, slow tradition of evil simplifiers. These were the later theologians, scribes, and church fathers who, in their desire to make the faith more rational, more philosophical, and more palatable to a skeptical world, systematically downplayed the literal reality of the supernatural conflict described in the Bible. Their motive was often born of a desire to defend the faith against the charge of being a primitive, superstitious religion. In the Greco-Roman world, and later during the Enlightenment, the idea of a universe filled with active, warring spiritual entities seemed unsophisticated. It was easier to win intellectual converts by presenting the struggles of the Old Testament as purely metaphorical or psychological. And so, the process of simplification began. The gods of the nations, like Molech and Baal, were no longer presented as the real, malevolent entities that the prophets confronted. They were reduced to mere idols, symbols of human greed or lust. The act of idolatry was reframed as a simple mistake in worship, a foolish choice to bow to a statue, rather than a treasonous act of entering into a covenant with a demonic power. The spiritual warfare that raged behind the scenes of history was transformed into an internal, moral struggle within the human heart. This was a profound act of demystification. It made the stories safer, cleaner, and easier to explain from the pulpit. It removed the uncomfortable and terrifying elements that didn't fit neatly into a rational theological system. But in doing so, the evil simplifiers committed a grave error. They were not just interpreting the story, they were fundamentally changing it. They took a narrative of cosmic, supernatural horror and turned it into a simple fable about the consequences of bad choices. They gave us a Jeremiah who was sad about human disobedience, but they hid from us the Jeremiah who was terrified by demonic possession. They thought they were making the faith more respectable, but in reality, they were stripping it of its power, its urgency, and its true terrifying context. They hid the face of the real enemy, and in doing so, they left the church strategically and spiritually disarmed. The legacy of this long, slow process of simplifying evil is the world many of us have inherited, a demystified, disenchanted version of the faith, by reducing the cosmic war to a mere moral struggle. The gatekeepers have left us with a story that has lost its terrifying and awe-inspiring scope. We live in the aftermath of their censorship, and the consequences are all around us. The most significant legacy is a profound misunderstanding of the true nature of sin, especially idolatry. We have been taught to think of idols as ancient statues in a museum, a primitive mistake made by unenlightened people. We fail to grasp what Jeremiah and the prophets knew in their bones, that idolatry is not just a flawed belief system, it is an open doorway. It is the act of willingly inviting ancient predatory spiritual entities into our lives, our families, and our cultures. By losing this understanding, we have lost the ability to diagnose the true root of the evils that plague our own society. We see greed, lust, and violence as purely human problems, failing to recognize the ancient spiritual forces that often animate and amplify them. This leads to a faith that is often strategically naive. We try to fight spiritual battles with purely psychological, political, or educational tools. We talk about changing mindsets and reforming systems, but we forget that we are often fighting against principalities and powers. As the Apostle Paul warned, we have been left with a gospel that speaks of forgiveness for sin, but is often silent about deliverance from the powers that drive that sin. Furthermore, this demystified worldview makes it difficult for us to understand the sheer visceral horror of the prophets and the ferocity of God's judgment. We read the Old Testament and are often shocked by the violence, by the commands to utterly destroy idolatrous nations. We judge these actions by our modern, sanitized standards because we no longer see the enemy that God saw. We see a war against people. He saw a war against the parasitic, demonic entities that had possessed them. The judgment was not just a punishment, it was a desperate, cosmic quarantine to stop a spiritual pandemic from spreading. The legacy of the evil simplifiers is a faith that is safer, more rational, but ultimately less powerful. We have been given a world where the monsters have been turned into metaphors. A world where the only devil is the one within us, but the testimony of Jeremiah and the forbidden books that hold the key to his terror cry out with a unified voice, the monsters are real, and by pretending they are not, we have left the doors to our own world wide open. For centuries, we have read the story of Jeremiah through the safe, demystified lens provided by the evil simplifiers. We have seen a sad prophet confronting a disobedient people. We have learned a moral lesson about the consequences of turning away from God. But the censored texts have now returned. The testimonies of Enoch and Jubilees have been unsealed, and the true, terrifying face of the enemy that Jeremiah confronted has been revealed. The choice is no longer in the hands of the ancient theologians who sought to protect us from a difficult truth. The power to see the full supernatural scope of the story has been returned to this generation. You have been shown the evidence. You have seen that the idolatry of Judah was not a simple mistake, but a covenant with demonic powers. You have understood that Jeremiah's tears were not just of sorrow, but of cosmic terror. And so you stand at a theological crossroads. You can choose to remain in the safe, rationalized world of the edited story. You can continue to see the spiritual battles of the Bible as mere metaphors for internal, psychological struggles. It is a less demanding and perhaps more comfortable path. Or you can choose to see what the prophet saw. You can choose to acknowledge the reality of the unseen war that rages behind the curtain of human history. You can choose to accept the difficult and terrifying truth that evil is not just an absence of good, but an active, intelligent, and predatory presence. This is not a choice to embrace superstition. It is a choice to embrace the full, unfiltered testimony of Scripture and the ancient texts that illuminate it. This is the moment you reclaim a more powerful and realistic understanding of your own faith. To see the real enemy is not to live in fear, but to live with clarity. It is to understand the true stakes of the battle we are in. It is to finally grasp the profound depth of the victory that was won on the cross. The gatekeepers offered you a simplified faith to protect you. Now, you have the opportunity to choose a stronger one, a faith that is not afraid to look the enemy in the eye. The secret vision of Jeremiah is not just a forgotten piece of ancient history. It is a present-day wake-up call. It is an urgent invitation to see the world as it truly is, a battlefield in a cosmic spiritual war. The same ancient forces that possess the heart of Judah are still at work today, cloaked in different ideologies, different technologies, and different idols, but with the same unchanging goal to draw humanity away from its Creator. This journey into the heart of Jeremiah's terror was never meant to leave you in fear, but to arm you with the truth, to understand that the struggle against sin is not just a personal, moral effort, but a participation in a war that has been raging since before the dawn of time. Your life, your choices, and your faith are not insignificant. They are strategic moves on this cosmic chessboard. So let this revelation change the way you pray, the way you think, and the way you live. Dare to read the Bible with your spiritual eyes open, recognizing the unseen conflict that surges beneath the surface of its stories. Understand that sin is never a neutral act. It is always a gateway. Honor the prophet Jeremiah not just as a man of tears, but as a lone warrior, a spiritual sentinel who stood his ground against an overwhelming supernatural foe. His story is a commission to us. It is a call to be sober, to be vigilant, because our adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. The fight is real, the enemy is real, but the victory is also real. The God who stood with Jeremiah, who ultimately cleansed his temple and promised a new covenant, is the same God who has equipped us for the battle today. The reason Jeremiah cried was not because the enemy was powerful, but because his own people had willingly joined them. Let us not make the same mistake. Welcome to the real, unsanitized, and ongoing spiritual war.